Okay, so this is the road to the Constitution. Make sure you watch the Shays Rebellion video first. So, this is kind of the in between time of our country. This is when we're operating on the Articles of Confederation, comes into being 1777, um, before we do the do over with the Constitution. As you can see from the video, the Articles of Confederation had some real problems, and you'll be writing about that. Um, Let's start with George Washington, American Cincinnatus. What does that mean? Do you know who Cincinnatus is? Well, if you're familiar with Roman history at all, he was the great hero of the Republic. Probably not real. Well, the Roman Republic had a government that was basically meant to slow things down. Executive power was in the hands of two consuls, which meant they had to agree to do anything. So it leads to a lot of inaction. Well, that doesn't work very well when you're at war like Rome was all the time. So what they had is the ability to name a dictator who would come in, take over absolute power, and then when the danger was gone, he would, go back to his life. And the first dictator was a man named Cincinnatus, who was a farmer that came to him and said, Cincinnatus, the Etruscans are bothering us. So he puts down his plow, picks up his sword, takes care of it, then immediately gives up power. Whether or not he's real or not, well, you know, it's hard to say, but the idea was that was how a dictator was supposed to be, only staying long enough to take care of the problem. Well, for George Washington was like that. He was the most popular man in the country. And he actually walked away from power. There were people who wanted to make him king. So he walked away from power actually twice. And in fact, he actually stopped the Newburgh conspiracy, which was where the army actually wanted to overthrow the Congress. So he actually, spoke to them and talked them down, saying that, he took out his glasses and says, "You have to forgive me. My eyes have grown weak in the service of my country." And, he talks them out of it and told them they have to support the government as it was. But, our government wasn't perfect because under the Articles of Confederation, it really wasn't one united country, except for maybe in foreign affairs. It was 13 individual states doing basically what they want. And, you have a lot of things going on. Education is seen as very important during this time. Thomas Jefferson will design the Virginia State Capitol, and he actually put forth a plan for publicly funded education. He wanted to give all white children 3 years of education and then send the best students to William and Mary on the state's dime. However, that was deemed too radical, so that wasn't passed. So, that's hardly anything today. We begin to see a lot of patriotic readers, education books based on basically based on, the ideas of patriotism, kind of a way to indoctrinate, if you will. Let me see here. So basically, the idea is to, thought I had a quote for you, I'm sorry, is to, educate Americans in civics and teach them skills so that they are more productive citizens and workers. And, really want to instill patriotism in them. One of the big problems during this time will be debtors versus creditors. And you basically saw that in the Shays Rebellion. So the new government had to basically decide what to do about those who were in debt. And there were a lot of people who were in debt at the time. Some states will produce a lot of paper currency. Rhode Island, for instance, will. Other states won't. The problem is you have 13 different uh, responses to this. And merchants tended to oppose paper money. They want to be paid in gold and maybe silver. Um, and so that was one of the first problems they had to deal with. And that's one of the things that's really going to bring the Articles of Confederation down. We see with Shays' Rebellion. This is a time where we have to deal with the British in the Ohio Valley. They had refused to leave because we hadn't paid them like we promised them. This is where we do pass the Northwest Ordinance, where we are going to settle the Ohio country. Jefferson actually wanted to create 16 states in what is Ohio in that area today. They do, however, pass the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which said once a territory had 5,000 people, they could elect a territorial legislature. When they had a 60,000, they could join the Confederation. And so, that's how new states would come about. Now, no new states will actually be added under the Articles of Confederation. That won't happen until the Constitution. Well, Shays' Rebellion happens. Again, make sure you watch that video. And so a lot of people were saying maybe this isn't working, this loose confederation of states, which, by the way, is what the Confederacy will try later. So delegates met from Maryland and Virginia at Mount Vernon with Washington in 1785. But, there are only 2 states there, so nothing happens. Another meeting is held in Indianapolis in 1786. This time, 5 states sent delegates. Finally, in 1787, 12 out of 13 states sent delegates to Philadelphia, and that's going to be the Constitutional Convention. So there is a strict rule of celibacy or secrecy. That was with Ben Franklin. You weren't going to have celibacy. Ben Franklin was a player, so I apologize for the slip of the tongue. Strict secrecy, where basically the idea was they felt if they can meet in private, more compromise can happen. Now, one person who wasn't there, and there were some really notable people there. James Madison, George Mason, there were 55 people altogether. Ben Franklin was the oldest. You had James Wilson. You might remember him from 1776. He was the best lawyer. You had Alexander Hamilton. And George Washington presided. Now, one notable person who wasn't there was Thomas Jefferson. He was the ambassador to France, and he actually denounced the meeting as a meeting of demagogues. So the first conflict when coming up with a new form of government, because basically they found the articles to be unworkable, that they couldn't really save them, so they decided to just start all over. So the first conflict is between representation between larger and smaller states. We have the Virginia plan, which called for an executive, a 2-house legislature, and a separate judiciary. The lower house would be directly elected by the people, and the upper house would be elected by the lower house. Small states obviously hated this because larger states would have more representatives in the lower house, and then therefore they would have more representatives in that upper house. William Patterson produced what was called the New Jersey Plan, which was a single legislature giving each state a vote, which is basically what they already had. Finally, on July 16, 1787, they have the Great Compromise, often known as the Connecticut Compromise, where basically they create a lower house directly elected by the people and a Senate where each state would send 2 representatives, and each state could basically decide how they chose their representatives. We won't have direct election of senators until the 20th century. The next conflict was over slavery. They argued over whether or not to ban the slave trade. So this is the first North versus South problem. You saw that in the 1776 video, though they didn't use the term peculiar institution yet, but you could already see the North-South tension on slavery. They decided to punt on the issue and made it in the Constitution that no decision could be made on the slave trade until 1808. George Mason wanted a 3-man executive, which would have been kind of interesting, I guess. Kind of had that in France under the Directorate. James Wilson wanted one president who was to be elected directly by the people. Unfortunately for us, I think, most people didn't think people were smart enough to directly elect a president, so that's how we ended up with the Electoral College, which is a terrible system that needs to go. Alexander Hamilton wanted a life term, which is not surprising because Alexander Hamilton very much is a monarchist. Some wanted a single term, perhaps 7 years. They compromised on 4-year terms and said the president could run for re-election as many times as he wanted. Next, they created a Supreme Court. And so now they had to get the Constitution ratified. And basically, they create the Supreme Court, but they'll fill out the courts with the first Congress. So you have two factions in America, the Federalists who want the Constitution versus Anti-Federalists who don't. The Federalists are more organized. The Anti-Federalists are different groups. The Federalists wrote the Federalist Papers, to really explain what they want. I'm not going to make you read those because they are kind of boring. So Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Connecticut all ratified pretty quickly. Massachusetts is where they had the first real showdown with the Anti-Federalists. Now, not all Anti-Federalists were the same. What the people of Massachusetts mainly wanted was a Bill of Rights. Some of the state constitutions that had been written during this time had one, like Virginia's. In fact, honestly, the state constitutions during this time are actually really interesting. There are some that are still in effect that are actually older than the Constitution itself, especially in Massachusetts. So the Federalists had this problem. Like, they didn't necessarily have a problem with doing the Bill of Rights, but there was a question of whether or not they should stop the process, go back, or just say, hey, when the Congress first meets, we got this amendment process, and when Congress first meets, we will do a Bill of Rights. It'll be one of the first things we work on. Well, they didn't want to stop momentum, so they said, we promise we'll do this as soon as it's ratified. Well, that was enough in Massachusetts, so it ratified. In New Hampshire, they also became the 9th, and then Virginia. And technically, it was ratified at that point, but eventually they wanted tie-in, but New York was still out there and a couple other states. So eventually they are able to get all states to ratify it. The Anti-Federalists kind of become the loyal opposition within the Congress. And so that's our first political split, our Federalists and Anti-Federalists, though the Federalists really argued against parties. They didn't really like the idea. Washington especially hated it. Well, now you had this problem of who was going to be the first president. Well, the problem was there was nobody who was loved in this country other than, universally loved other than George Washington. And so he agreed to run. When the Electoral College met for the first time on February 4th, 1789, he was unanimously chosen president. Basically, the way that it worked is you had 2 votes. Each elector had 2 votes. The person who gets the most votes was the president. Whoever got the second most votes became vice president. It's going to be complicated later. They're actually going to have to change it. John Adams gets half as many votes, and he becomes vice president. Then Washington traveled from Mount Vernon to New York City, which would be the temporary home of the capital. It was supposed to be in New York and then in Philadelphia. James Madison was convinced to run for a congressional seat in Virginia. James Madison they felt like since he was basically the writer of the Constitution, he really needed to be in Congress to write this new Bill of Rights. James Madison does win with the help of a new religious group known as the Baptists. Now, that was pretty quick because I think the Shays Rebellion video does a really good job. Plus, you're going to read and you're going to see other things about the road to the Constitution. So that's really all I have to say for this particular lecture. I hope that you found it informative. Again, next week I hope to do a whole lot better. Hopefully, my head is not spinning. But until next time, where we talk about the terms of Washington and Adams.